Nolan, a skilled diver with several undersea adventures under his belt, had always been drawn to the mysteries of the deep blue. On a group expedition off the Californian coast, the team came across the shadowy outline of an aircraft, hidden beneath the waves. The excitement of discovery soon turned to dread as they ventured inside the eerie, aquatic tomb. What they encountered inside made their blood run cold. Nolan had always loved diving, living his entire life near the sea. Getting his PLDA was like getting his driver's license. Both were equally important in his day-to-day life. Getting that certificate eventually ensured him of his job and allowed him to dive anywhere in the world. Nevertheless, nothing felt like diving near the coast that he was from. Nolan believed that he had seen it all. He'd been to all the major reefs in the world, though it had been for his job as a marine biologist instead of leisure. It was always the spot near the California coast that made him dive for leisure and inadvertently made him fall alive while diving all over again. And that was until he spotted that strange thing underneath the water surface. It had been during one of their routine expeditions to check the reefs and the state of the area's biodiversity. Though it had been part of Nolan's job, he always loved diving near the California coast. They had gone here many times before. However, it seemed like something significant had changed, as they had never seen this before. Under the water, especially so far under, there was no way to communicate with his colleagues audibly, and with the sight before them, there simply weren't enough pre-discussed signs to explain what they were seeing. Even with the goggles on his and his colleagues' faces, he could see their expressions. Everyone was genuinely shocked. They had come here numerous times, but this time was the first time they had spotted this anomaly. The insides of Nolan screamed for him to go closer, to research the foreign structure, but before they could do that, they had to make sure that was the wisest course of action. They had to ensure everyone's safety first. Nolan had dived through abandoned ships before. He was an expert on those types of explorations, and because of that he certainly didn't fear entering what looked like an old sunken plane. However, the limited hand gestures he and his colleague had discussed didn't cover the wide scope of what they could find there. They had to make a plan. As the crew's safety was the most important to Nolan's supervisor, he gestured for them to start their venture back to the surface. This also wasn't an easy task, as they had to acclimate to the shifting pressure, and their excitement mixed with worry didn't help their patient. Luckily, their professionalism took them to the surface without, seemingly, any issue. When Nolan and his colleagues resurfaced, they all spat out their regulators. "Did you guys see that? What is that thing doing here?" One of Nolan's colleagues, Irene, exclaimed. Though everyone had seen it, no one knew what the abandoned plane was doing there. They had to get aboard the boat to check if it could possibly be due to a recent crash, or if there could be other reasons. Nolan and the rest of his team quickly went aboard the boat they originally came with. The captain of the ship was confused at their fast return. He always made sure to time the duration of their underwater endeavors. This time around, they couldn't have been under for longer than 20 minutes. So when Nolan and his team told him what they had found, he quickly understood. Nolan and the diver team needed to be able to discuss this using words. Furthermore, he knew that they also had to call the Coast Guard to help them find where this plane could possibly have come from. You would think that it hadn't just appeared out of thin air. After hearing their story, the captain made a quick call which hopefully would give Nolan and his team the information that they would need during their exploration. If the plane could be a candidate for one that had recently gone down, they had to take a different approach. The newer the plane, the bigger the chance of bodies, which increased the possibilities of other, more lively things being inside the plane as well. The team waited with anticipation for the Coast Guard to return with information. Since such information didn't always get extended to them, they needed to make various phone calls themselves. Luckily, it didn't take too long for them to finally reconnect to the boat, and the Coast Guard sure had some news that shocked the crew. With the numbers on the side of the plane that Nolan's supervisor had spotted and communicated to their ship's captain, the Coast Guard was quick to find out when and where the plane had crashed. Nolan hoped that it was from a longer time ago. He was super curious about what could possibly be inside. However, the only way to explore it was if it had been in the water for quite some time. When the Coast Guard returned the call, Nolan was waiting in anticipation. He tried to read the captain's face, but his expression remained stoic. He could only hear a few sounds of agreement. When the man placed the phone back and turned his attention back to the divers and his crew, he gave Nolan's supervisor, James, a nod. The plane dates back several years, if not decades. It had been said that it had simply disappeared, The Coast Guard is unsure how it came to be on the Californian coast, but as long as we report back our findings, we are free to explore and study the object," the captain said. Nolan was giddy with excitement, but he had no clue what was actually waiting for him on the ocean's floor. In the early morning light, Nolan's team laid out their dive gear with ritual precision on the deck. Each piece of equipment was accounted for: fins, masks, air tanks, and suits. Nolan checked his dive computer, ensuring the nitrogen levels were set for the depth they'd be hitting. It was a dive like no other they had performed, and Nolan felt the familiar thrill of a challenge tinged with the anxiety of the unknown. "Let's triple-check everything," he told his team. "We can't afford slip-ups today." With their gear ready, Nolan gathered his team for a final review of their deep dive procedures. They pored over charts of the dive site, discussing the topography of the ocean floor and potential hazards. James took the lead, laying out the emergency plan, detailing ascent times and decompression stops. Irene presented the new hand signals they would use, ones that would let them communicate complex messages in the silent depths. The gravity of their mission was clear in their focused expressions. The team circled up for a sobering discussion led by Nolan. "We might be the first to touch history since this plane went down," he said. He spoke of preserving integrity for any artifacts they found and the proper protocol for documenting the site. It was essential they disturb as little as possible while recording as much as they could. Nolan, with the methodical nature of a seasoned biologist, went over the inventory. They had brought along underwater cameras, lighting systems, and salvage bags. Every diver was equipped with a personal locator beacon and a knife for safety and potential entanglements. The specialized equipment included a metal detector and sonar for mapping the site. "Let's not leave anything to chance," Nolan insisted. They all knew that once below, the success of their dive depended on this preparation. Hours later, the final rehearsal took place on the stern. Nolan and his crew simulated the dive, practicing their newly devised signals. James monitored the time, while Irene quizzed each member on the signals and emergency procedures. They acted out scenarios, from discovering the plane to signaling distress. As the sun climbed higher, casting a glittering path across the water, the team felt the silent camaraderie of a group bound by a shared quest. Their movements were sharp, their resolve firmer with each drill. As they began their descent, the azure blanket of the Pacific slowly darkened to an indigo abyss. Each breath Nolan took was a meditative step into history's depth, the plane's lore heavy in his mind. His heart raced with a cocktail of excitement and respect for the unknown chapter of aviation history they were about to witness. As they sank deeper, the pressure built around them, a physical reminder of the ocean's vast power. Eyes on the depth gauge, the team communicated with their lights, their bubbles ascending like prayers into the blue above. The first sight of the aircraft's silhouette against the sparse light from above struck the team like a core. There it was, an enigma lying in solemn stillness. They hovered around the craft, documenting the weathered markings and bullet holes that spoke of its untold past. So the realization that they were floating over a possible tomb tempered their exhilaration. Solon directed the team to capture every inch, their cameras flashing, sketching the grim tableau for the surface world. Circling the wreckage, the divers methodically surveyed the site. Each diver had a role, mapping, photographing, and assessing the structure's integrity. They communicated through gestures, forming a live chain of discovery as they marked the plane's boundary with bright buoy lines. The meticulousness of their task at hand gave them focus, allowing them to set aside the eerie quiet that surrounded them. So this perimeter served as a respectful boundary for the sanctity of the site and a guideline for the investigative dance they performed. Nolan and Irene, poised at the aircraft's broken doorway, exchanged a glance that carried the weight of their task. So with a nod, they signaled the team to begin the interior examination. The threshold was a portal to a bygone era, and as they slipped through, the currents seemed to whisper of histories waiting to be reclaimed from the silence. Each diver knew that the cabin might hold more than just secrets, it could be a memorial to souls once lost. The divers' lights pierced the murk, unveiling the plane's innards like a slow revelation. Seats and luggage were strewn in disarray, suspended in the still water. The team moved with grave gentleness, their beams catching on cables and glass shards, on a pilot's logbook frozen mid-sentence, a faded photograph, and a cockpit that once brimmed with life. This was more than a dive, it was a communion with the past, each diver a silent witness to the quietude that held the plane in its ceaseless embrace. The divers swam through the cabin, their lights casting long shadows behind the floating debris as of lives interrupted. Amidst the silent cacophony of motionless chaos, they found personal belongings, wallets, jewelry, writing utensils, all preserved in the cold sailing like relics of a time capsule. Stillness was poignant, interrupted only by the sound of their own breathing apparatus. It was a tableau of preserved urgency, each item a frozen echo of the passengers' last moments. Amidst the silt and silent stories, Nolan spotted an anomaly, a briefcase, its leather surface hardly aged, strapped and locked to the seat's metal frame. It seemed out of place, secure in its position as if guarding its contents against the passage of time. What could it contain? Perhaps, or confidential documents? Nolan signaled to the team, his eyes conveying the excitement of the find. It was an unexpected turn in their underwater investigation, promising new layers of enigma. The team couldn't help but be drawn to the artifacts that floated around them, evoking the era when the plane had last seen the sky. Handbags and hats pinned in 40s fashion, a child's doll with glassy eyes, newspapers with faded headlines discussing the stirrings of a world at war. These items were more than archaeological treasures, they were intimate glimpses into a narrative that had ended abruptly, violently sending ripples through time that had led the divers here. With great care, the divers began to collect what they could. Irene gently placed a pocket watch, its hands stopped, into a collection bag. Nolan photographed a string of pearls draped over the edge of an overhead bin. Each click of the camera shutter encapsulated a moment that transcended time. So the smallest piece could be a key to unlocking the history of the flight. They worked diligently, knowing that their findings would soon be scrutinized by eager historians and possibly anxious families. As they continued their underwater reconnaissance, an unshakable unease crept into each diver's spine. This aircraft, a keeper of untold stories, seemed reluctant to yield its secrets. The manifest had listed casual travelers, businessmen, and families, but the presence of the briefcase, secured away from prying eyes, suggested clandestine motives. So were these passengers mere cover for a more secretive mission? With every clue gathered, the weight of the unseen and unsaid filled their chests like the ocean's pressure. Nolan hovered before the sealed compartment door, its edges crusted with barnacles that obscured its original contours. It stood defiantly closed, a barrier to understanding the narrative that had sunk with this metal carcass. So with no visible means to force it without risking damage to potential evidence, Nolan felt a chill that wasn't from the water. What lay beyond? He traced the door's cold metal, wondering if its secrets were meant to be kept from the world above. Back on the surface, the air was thick with conversation. The discovery of the sealed door was significant. It turned their dive from a recovery to a potentially historic exploration. What lay behind the door? Was it a simple cargo hold or something more? The implications were enormous, and the risks just as great. They could not rush this. The door was a threshold that demanded respect, its opening a move that had to be calculated with precision. Nolan stood dripping before the communication equipment, detailing the day's findings. His report, methodically describing the sealed compartment, was more than just procedure. It was a dispatch that would mark the beginning of a significant chain of events. As he spoke, he knew that this was beyond mere treasure hunting or exploration. This was a dive into the annals of unknown history. The response from the authorities was swift, interest peaked, a mix of caution and excitement tinged their instructions. There was an urgency in the air, but it was tempered by the knowledge that what they did next had to be done right. The ocean floor was not a place for impulsive actions, and the laws governing salvage and discovery were clear and strict. Irene reminded the team of their responsibility to preserve the integrity of the site. "We have protocols for a reason," she asserted. "What we find, and how we find it, will be scrutinized by the eyes of the world." On the deck of the vessel, the team gathered, wrapped in towels and the waning sunlight. The discussion was animated, each member weighing in on the potential revelations the sealed compartment could yield. Could it be espionage, or a private trove? Someone mused. The legality of opening the compartment, the preparation for what they might find, and the historical significance all swirled in the salty breeze. They knew the next steps they took could rewrite a chapter of history or close it forever. The crackling radio signal cut through the maritime air as Nolan relayed their coordinates and findings to the Coast Guard. "Sierra Tango 419er to Coast Guard Command, come in," he called. Descriptions of the submerged plane, the sealed compartment, and the undisturbed aura of the site were methodically broadcasted. This call would place the mysterious aircraft back on the radar of the present, transcending years of silence. The waiting response would determine the future of their expedition. The sea echoed the team's restlessness as they awaited further commands. The vessel became a temporary home, a space between discovery and disclosure. Each hour stretched longer than the last, filling with the hum of idle engines. With little else to do, the team maintained their equipment, checked their data, and speculated on the historical tapestry they had stumbled upon. The wait was both a blessing and a curse, a pause in time just like the plane beneath the waves. Speculation grew like a storm as the dive team congregated around maps and dive logs. Could it be a relic from a covert operation? One diver posited, turning the conversation into a labyrinth of theories. Another pointed out the era-specific artifacts, suggesting a possible connection to historical events from decades past. As they shared stories and hypotheses, the sealed compartment served as a vault for their imaginations, holding untold tales as securely as it did its contents. The radio crackled to life, a voice from the Coast Guard cutting through the maritime static. "All teams, stand by for further instructions," it commanded. Nolan's grip tightened on the receiver. "Stand by." After such a discovery, the team's collective hearts sank a little, even as their minds understood the need for patience. The directive left them in limbo, suspended between their passion for exploration and their respect for authority. The unopened compartment below was a siren, calling them back to the blue depths. Under the canopy of the vessel's bridge, the team huddled, their discussion turning towards the weighty implications of their find. "If it's classified equipment or information from the Cold War era, for example, we could be in over our heads," Irene cautioned. The team knew the discovery could have far-reaching effects. They weighed the excitement of the find against the reality of such complications, each aware that the history they were eager to uncover could change the current of their lives. The sun began its descent as a sleek, gray vessel approached, cutting through the calm sea with authoritative speed. Its arrival was unexpected and unannounced, causing a stir among Nolan's team. The so-called insurance recovery team aboard communicated via radio, requesting information on the plane's location. Nolan, wary of the vessel's timely appearance and smooth facade, signaled his team to stay alert. The ocean's expanse had brought them more than just historical remains to contend with. Tensions escalated as the new arrivals hailed Nolan's team again, this time asking to board their ship for a routine check. Yet they balked at providing proper credentials or specifying which insurer they represented. Their vague explanations and evasive answers led to heightened suspicion among the divers. The team scrutinized the vessel, noting its lack of company markings or flags, a stark contrast to the regulatory protocols usually observed in such operations. A standoff ensued, the ocean stillness mirroring the stalemate between the two vessels. Nolan, taking charge, instructed his team to secure the research and findings. "No one boards this ship without clear authorization," he declared over the radio. His firm stance made it clear that they would not relinquish control of the discovery or compromise the site's integrity. The mysterious crew's insistence only intensified the urgency of the situation, casting a dark cloud over the otherwise clear maritime skies. Nolan's hand steadied the radio as he sought confirmation from the Coast Guard. Requesting immediate verification on the vessel claiming insurance recovery, he demanded. The team waited, the static of the radio a reminder of the uncertainty of their position. The legitimacy of the new vessel's crew hung in the balance, their true purpose shrouded in ambiguity. Until they received the Coast Guard's word, no action could be taken, a game of a chance played on the high seas. As night enveloped the sea, the so-called recovery vessel hovered like an uneasy shadow. The crew's persistence did nothing to assuage the dive team's unease, leaving the true nature of their interest cloaked in mystery. Nolan and Irene exchanged glances, aware that the lack of confirmation from the Coast Guard only deepened the enigma. With the plane's secrets lying dormant below and potential threats lurking above, the team found themselves navigating a sea of uncertainty. As night turned the ocean to ink, Nolan's team kept a diligent watch over the wreck site. The metallic taste of salt in the air mixed with their growing concern when silhouettes of unauthorized divers were spotted in the distance. Their vessel's floodlights cast long shadows underwater, betraying a clandestine activity unsettlingly close to the aircraft's resting place. The divers' presence, ghostly and unwelcome, was a stark reminder that the depths held a lure for many, not all with pure intentions. So when the scattered lights of unknown divers pierced the abyss, Nolan's vessel became a hive of tension. Quick, determined discussions erupted, with binoculars trained on the distant illumination below. Could it be the mysterious crew from the unmarked vessel attempting to explore or exploit the wreck? On Irene's initiative, they prepared the floodlights to signal a warning, illuminating the waves in a bright, unequivocal stance of territory and claim. The ocean's quiet was shattered by the sound of their preparedness. A sighting of the unauthorized divers was a clear breach of protocol, igniting a powder keg of tension aboard the ship. Questions mounted faster than answers could be provided. Nolan's jaw set firmly as he contemplated the possible desecration of the site. His voice crackled through the radio, issuing a stern warning to the shadowy figures below to surface and identify themselves. But the only response was the muffled dance of their dive lights against the dark water. Back in his cabin, Nolan pored over the photographs and notes from their initial dive, the images of the wreck illuminating the walls with ghosts of history. His mind raced, wondering if he had overlooked any detail that could explain the plane's fate or its uninvited visitors. Each piece of evidence seemed to whisper its own theory, yet the plane's enigmatic presence below remained a puzzle. The weight of discovery bore heavily on him, reflecting on what else the murky depths might reveal. Amid the crisis, a heated debate erupted among the crew. The wreck was more than a dive site, it was a time capsule, potentially a war grave that demanded respect. Some argued for leaving the plane untouched, a memorial in the deep. Others contended that its historical value necessitated every risk of exploration. The discussion spiraled into a broader conversation about the sanctity of such sites. So guardians of a slice of hidden history, the ethical boundaries of their responsibility weighed on them as heavily as the ocean's pressure. Dawn cast a gentle light on the Pacific as the suspicious vessel lifted its anchor, its silhouette retreating into the horizon. Questions clung to the air like the lingering night mist. Had they found something in their nocturnal probing, or were they scared off by the team's vigilance? Nolan's team recorded the vessel's departure time and any surface activity they could cite. The quiet after its departure was unsettling. It was a silent admittance that the sea keeps its secrets well, yielding them only to the patient and the persistent. The radio crackled to life with the voice of the Coast Guard, cutting through the morning's tension with words they had been waiting for, permission granted. The clearance to investigate further was not just procedural, it was a green light into the unknown. Nolan felt the weight of new responsibilities settle on his shoulders. This next dive wasn't just an exploration, it was a step into a bigger world of geopolitical and historical webs, where each thread was as delicate as it was dangerous. So as they prepped for the dive, each member of Nolan's team was encased in their own cocoon of contemplation and anxiety. So were silent acknowledgement that they were about to unravel threads of history that had been lost in aquatic obscurity. The atmosphere was charged with a blend of scientific zeal and the grim reality of facing a potentially dark slice of the past. Irene checked her gear meticulously, her focus a shield against the swell of trepidation within. The sun, now fully asserting its morning glory, illuminated the divers as they suited up. The air hummed with the sound of oxygen tanks and the rustle of neoprene. Final equipment checks were punctuated with terse reminders of emergency procedures. Nolan oversaw the preparations with a practiced eye, ensuring every flashlight, every strap, and every tank was accounted for. They were not just diving into water but piercing the veil of a story that had ended abruptly, decades ago, leaving only whispers behind. So with the sun overhead casting beams into the blue, the dive team stepped off their boat into the embrace of the ocean. Descending back into the twilight zone of the deep, Nolan led the team, their bubbles trailing behind them like ascending ghosts. Each diver was acutely aware of the potential consequences riding on their shoulders. Our dive lights cut through the water, drawing them closer to the concealed truths resting with the plane. This was the moment of truth, and the ocean's silent guardians were watching. The compartment door, resistant at first, gave way under the combined effort of the team, revealing its hidden contents. The beams of their flashlights cut across the void, scattering shadows across the once sealed space. Nolan's breath came steadily through his regulator, a counterpoint to his racing heart. He knew that history was rarely found intact, that tales of the deep were often fragmented. But as the door swung open, it promised revelations untouched by the decay of time or the distortion of retelling. The compartment was a snapshot of an era thought to be long dissolved in the saltwater cradle of the ocean. Sealed away were items preserved in a time capsule crafted by accident and urgency. There were no signs of organic remains, only the artifacts and trappings of a journey interrupted. Nolan and the team moved with reverential care, the enormity of their discovery settling upon them. They were no longer mere observers but custodians of a lost narrative waiting to be told. So the first item to emerge from the shadows was more than a mere object, it was a passage back through time. It was delicate yet preserved by the pressure and cold, a paradox of vulnerability and endurance. The artifact, a small, intricate mechanism of unknown use, was cradled in Irene's hands, her gloves guarding it from the present as she swam toward the ascent line. Nolan watched, knowing that its true value was not in its material but in the story it held within. Methodically, the team collected everything that could be moved without damaging the integrity of the site. Papers that were miraculously preserved, personal effects still hinting at the identities of those they once belonged to, and navigational tools that seemed from another world. Nolan had seen many recoveries, but none so poignant. Each item was a thread in a tapestry of unknown contexts, woven into the fabric of a mystery that had lingered beneath the waves, awaiting this very moment of recovery. As their bottom time ran out, Nolan and the team prioritized objects for ascension, marking the rest for future retrieval. So water around them was a flurry of activity as they documented, collected, and prepared to leave. Time underwater was finite, and the responsibility to uncover, preserve, and share the discovery was a race against the relentless ticking of their dive computers and the limitations of human endurance. As they started their ascent, they knew the surface held a different race, a race to understand. Once surfaced, the stark brightness on deck was a stark contrast to the shadowy depths. The artifacts, now sprawled on the table, seemed alien to the open air. Nolan watched as the team, with a mix of exhilaration and fatigue, pored over the soggy documents and the enigmatic artifact, attempting to dry them without causing damage. The text was surprisingly legible, suggesting a planned effort to preserve it against the expected submersion. Cameras clicked, capturing the evidence before the salt and air could begin their oding work. It didn't take long for the pieces to start fitting together. A manifest listed not just passenger names, but cryptic cargo entries. And the document's maps and orders smeared with the seal of officialdom but never recorded in public archives. So were hints of clandestine missions, dates aligning with historical crises, and codenames known only in whispers. The past shadows began to take shape, framing a picture that would demand a rewrite of what was publicly known. The implications of their find were immense. Each document was a thread pulling at the edges of a long-sealed truth. The plane, they realized, was no mere missing craft, it was a vessel for secrets that bore the weight of nations. Cargo lists corresponded with missing government inventory, and some passengers had ties to intelligence communities. As they assembled the evidence, the magnitude of what they had uncovered settled heavily upon them, along with the realization that they were now part of the story. Government officials arrived with the evening tide, their badges of authority in nondescript suits standing out against the backdrop of the marine tableau. They listened, took notes, and then took everything. The air was tense with unasked questions as Nolan's team recounted their dive. With professionalism and quiet insistence, the officials emphasized the sensitivity of the discovery. Nolan and his crew were thanked for their service to historical truth and then promptly sworn to silence with the weight of duty and patriotism. In the aftermath, as the officials departed with the day's find, Nolan and his team sat in the waning light, the thrill of discovery tempered by a solemnity that had not been there the day before. They were part of something larger than the sum of their careers, yet the fullness of their role might never be acknowledged. They shared looks that conveyed the unspeakable pride, curiosity, concern, and a lingering sense of loss. The ocean had given up its secret, but at what cost to history and to them?